Hello, welcome to another video, and now I want to talk about exporting the flag for a game engine. In my example, I'm going to use UE5, and I'm going to show multiple ways or methods of doing this. So here I'm specifically talking about a cloth simulation or a soft body simulation and exporting that into Unreal. So here, if you followed along, we had a setup like this. So we had the flag, and if I press play, we had like some animation there. So I added a small wind value here. Now I want to first make this simulation a bit nicer and also loopable. So if I go here all the way to the end, so I have about 80 frames. So it's a good idea to sort of like keep it a bit smaller, especially for a very basic simulation like this. We probably don't even need 80 frames. We can probably go even smaller. So make sure you are finding a good number of frames there. So, but as you can see right now, it's not really like loopable. It's like jumping here at the beginning. And also I want the flags to actually have like a more of a wave feeling, like they're actually waving through the wind. Right now, they're not really like waving that much, as you can see. Now, a very cool trick to add some nice or control parameters is we can right click here and we're going to go to motion and we're going to say a wave motion. So now we actually have, as you can see, this wave menu, and we also have some special values here to override that parameter. So if I now would press play, we see that they actually now will go more into a wave. So we could play around with this more, so we can change like how long this should be. We could also like try to also match it up at the end and the beginning a bit, if you want that. We can then play around with these values, maybe make it more intense, maybe like do more amplitude. So you can like play around with that and then make it as much intense as you want it to be. I think this is pretty nice here of what I want. So we have that ready to go. So that's the quick way of adding an animation. So, and you can do this with every single parameter. So even though if I would take an extrude or a bevel, I can also like right click and add an animation there. What is interesting with that is that there is a node created for that, which is called here the motion effects. So this is actually controlling that parameter. So now let's go to the next step. So here is my output, and I would like this to be tileable, loopable, so we can actually use this in a game and just let it loop in game time. So there is a useful node inside of X Labs, which is just called make loop. So again, instead of X Labs, if you have not installed this, let's go here to Labs. So very important, because I'm going to also use different exporters from Labs. So we can now just plug that in over here. We make loop, and we can just let's press play to see what we have. So this is the looping result. So you can see at this point in the middle here, it's sort of like giving us this frame, which is not that nice. So what we can do is we can play around with the start and end frames, which can be very useful. So the reason why I have this result is because of the starting frame, which looks like this. So that's of course a bit wrong here, but we can also change the input type. So we have volumes, we have particles, and we have primitives. So I'm actually using primitives now. So it might be a logical way of using the primitive type. So let's try and use that. So let's press play. And currently this gives a really good result. And it's perfectly looping, just like I want it to be. And that is how easy you could make something loopable. So of course, this is a quite simple setup. If you have something more complex, you might want to definitely play around with some of the settings here, maybe change different starting frame, or maybe change different type here. Then let's talk about exporting this right now. So for now, I'm going to like export the flag simulation separated from the flagpole. So previously I made a flagpole. So you can either merge them together or we can separate them. So I can only say like, hey, I want to spend more resources on this flag because it needs to be simulated or has this animation. So I'm gonna like separate that. So there are three ways I want to talk about in this video. So we have something which is called a vertex animation or VAT. We have something which is called DemBones, and we have Alembic files. So these three types of animation I want to talk about. So with bringing complicated simulations in game engines can be quite interesting and have multiple approaches. Changing to a different game engine or using a custom game engine might be different on how you want to implement these simulations. So for example, let's start with the vertex animation. What I'm first going to do is maybe place a null node here. And I'm just going to call this out sim loop. And let's select this. So this is currently my output. Then I would like to go to my output tab. So here I already have it open. So if you don't have this, you could, for example, just add an extra network view, and then you can just switch to outputs. So I like to have it open so I can easily switch between the geometry and the output. So in here, we're gonna just type in VAT, so vertex animated textures. So we have that ready. And if you're not sure really what this is, it's sort of already a bit in the naming. So we're gonna animate the vertex of a model based on textures. So we will have different textures that will just say what a certain vertex needs to do over time. So that's what vertex animation sort of is. So animating a vertex or the points of your model over the time. So here we have some settings of this node. Very important here at the beginning is setting what type of simulation you have. So currently I'm having, again, soft bodies. So I'm just having cloth. If you have something with destructibles or fluid or sprites, you're going to have to change that. So I have just soft bodies. I'm also going to use Unreal Engine, so I'm going to leave that. We are going from 1 to 80, and now we need to get a reference to that geometry. So here in output, we can just select tube, or you can specifically select the output simulation if you want that. So we can press accept, and we are almost ready to go with that. So you can further play around with different settings and what type of data it needs to export. So again, this will export a model and textures to animate. So we can play around with these settings. So I'm going to leave it by default. So everything is by default. Here's the export location. So it's under my hip file, export hip name. Then we have an advanced mode. So we have a live mode. And then also interesting here is actually the shaders for the game engine, which I'm going to talk about in a sec. So at this point, I'm not going to change too much. I'm just going to press render. So this might take a moment. So there will probably a pop-up menu here. So once that rendered, if we go to our files, we can see we have some geometry, and we also have the three textures. So color, position, and rotation. So we're going to have to import that into Unreal in a moment. Now important here is if I go to real-time shaders, we actually need to do some setup. So we need a certain shader in Unreal or Unity or whatever game engine you use to actually use the textures that we just baked out and use a certain instructions to then have the shader animate that vertex. So if you click this button here to open our guide, we will open this menu and we're going to choose our Unreal version. So I'm going to use Unreal 5, and here is some installation info on how to use this. So I'm going to show you like the quick version of this. So you can always open here the guides if you want to have more information on that. So what you're going to do is you're going to create an Unreal project. This can be an empty project or something you already have. And these are the files of my project. And we want to have a folder which is called plugins. So in this case, I don't have that folder. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to create a new folder. And I'm just going to call this plugins. So make sure it's typed correctly. And in here, we're now just going to drag and drop the labs folder. So make sure it's copy. And what's special here is that in here we have certain contents and resources. So we have, for example, material information and material functions. So these are the functions to use with the VAT node. So as you can see, we have, for example, a soft body material function. So this is very useful. So I don't have to build this from scratch, or I can just place my function. So I can actually just place the material function and have that ready to go. And now it is time to go into Unreal and set our first simulation up. So in Unreal, we just installed some plugin data, and I would like to see that in here as well. So if I make this a bit bigger, I don't have any like plugin data that I just added, as you can see. So what we're going to have to do to see this is we can go to settings and enable plugin content. And if you scroll all the way down to side effects, we should now have our content. So we have the material functions. So now we can actually use this in the material. Now let's go and import our data. So first is here our geometry. And we're going to have to quite specifically enable and disable certain settings. So in my case, a good value. So I might going to just like head the defaults. If you're not sure what you're doing, you can always look in those documents provided by side effects. So what they recommend in the doc is that you disable most of the settings. So let's disable most of the settings here, like so. And let's go through them. So one of the first things to do is here vertex color. So we want to set this to replace. Then you can enable some of these, but I think those are optional for now. This is important to enable. We also want to import the normals and the tangent as well. That's important to know. Just make sure you're not using a light map UV, because the UV channels are important here. So there's Vertex animations uses multiple UV channels sometimes, so be careful with that. Also, I'm going to leave the scale and the rotation to 1. You probably want to enable convert scene, can be quite important here. Then the materials, so do not create any new materials, not import any textures. I would like to have an empty scene, and we could enable here reorder to FBX. So I think that's good enough to go. So let's import that. And now we have a model. So we have now the flags. They're automatically like scaled up to game size. So maybe they're, in my case, maybe a bit too big. So let's scale them down. Now next up are the textures. So I can just drag and drop them in here. And we also need to give them certain properties. And this is quite quickly done by right-clicking, going to scripts, actions, and use the side effects set VAT HDR textures. And this is basically also linked in what you had open in Houdini. So in Houdini, there was a setting which is using either HDR or non-HDR. So make sure you are using the correct one. So, but by default, if you don't really touch any parameters, it will be HDR. So that's done. We need that plugin enabled. Otherwise, you won't have all these options. Now, next step is then creating a material. So we have the geometry, but then I also need a certain shader that sort of like animates this from the texture data. So we're going to right click material, going to do some flag VAT. So this is our material. Let's make some room. So we're going to just right click and search for a soft body. So here we have 2 of them. So we're just using very basic setup. So we are just using the first one. So then we can see that we can have multiple values. So interesting can be speed. So I can have a value for speed. Let's give it 1. You can also like right click, expose parameter, speed. And then the only thing we need here for the moment is actually only the position. So the other ones can be useful here, but actually the position is here quite important. So now let's create a texture object for that. So texture object. And I would like to have that in there. So that's connected to each other. Then we have color, normal, world offset, and our custom UV channels. Quite interesting here is that we actually need to have world offset for the animation itself. So let's plug that in over here. Let's save. And you can already see here in our view here that this is already distorting or manipulating the shape here. So now let's go and hit right click and make an instance. This is quite important to do. Then open the instance and we will have a bunch of parameters by default. So placing this node here will automatically enable you to have these values here. So of course we need to set a number of frames. So if you remember, we used 80 frame numbers. So that will help with simulation, of course. Now let's just drag and drop that material on here. And we can see that that automatically works. And normally our speed, if I would, for example, go lower, we now have that as well. So we basically already got this working. So the only thing left would be then, for example, our base color and other things. So you have certain data here, extra like the color and the rotation, but those are actually not really needed at the moment. And I can also just use my base texture here that I had. So if I can just plug that in over here and save out, it will actually use my base UV, my first UV. And as you can see, this is working as expected. So this is just some very basic introduction to the whole Vertex animation things. You can do, of course, more things with it. As you can see, we have some more texture enables. They have some other nodes. So if you just type in the VAT, you have some other nodes for very specific things. But this is just a very basic setup for that. So let me move my flag over here and hit play. I can now have that. Vertex animation is pretty cool because you can do quite complex simulations and approaches and import that into Unreal. So now let's jump into another method. Then let's talk about DemBones exporter. So I'm here again with my simulation in Houdini. If we're going to type in DemBones, you will see this node. So this is actually some technology that EA developed, and it's pretty neat. So only thing we have to do is we just plug it in and we're basically ready to go. So we can already start exporting this. So again, you can fill in the location, we can say the number of frames, we can use the bind pose frame. And important here is the bones. So DemBones works, of course, based on bones. So it will convert this cloud simulation into bones actually. So the thing that we have to say now is how many bones I want to spend on this simulation. So since this is not super complex, we can probably go lower than 30. I mean, 30 is already a quite high amount for just something like this. So you can go, for example, maybe 10 or even lower if you want to. So let's try 10. We can always go a bit back and forward and re-import that data. So let's just press export. And this should be quite fast in calculation. And now we can import this. So we're going to have this import menu. And again, make sure you're importing the skeletal mesh and the animation. So this is quite important because this is a skeletal mesh because it has bones. So we need to import that animation. So make sure that is all enabled. So furthermore here again, import animation, exported time is fine, scale 1 is fine. Other settings are fine. So I think we are ready to just click import now. So that is imported, and let's take a look here at that. So here is my animation. And as you can see, it's already working. So I quite like this method because there is almost no setup with this. You just export, import, and you're done. So that's pretty cool. But again, this might be limiting in certain complex situations. So since this tutorial is about just a simple flag, this works without a problem. If you're going to make something very complicated simulation, then you might hit some limitations because this is based on bones, and you might want to be careful with how many bones you are spending on a simulation here. So we can select the animation, drag and drop this, and we have that here. So my scale is pretty small, so I can go back into Houdini and actually make the scale bigger since there is a units difference, or I could just say here multiply by 15 and we have this bit bigger. So I can just also grab my material. We have that working. So also the pivot here is also actually the pivot still of my other model. So if I would bring in the flagpole here for a moment. So here I have this flagpole and I can just now grab the position. So copy and paste that here. So paste position and then rotate this 90 degrees and we have that ready. And we have this in our game engine. And this is then how you use that DemBones tool. So pretty easy in setup. Only thing to remember here that this is bone based, so you're gonna have to spend bones to have this animated. Next step now is Alembic files. So again, it's quite similar to my DemBone process. So I'm just gonna place the Alembic node. So if I type here Alembic, we have a couple Alembic nodes. So we have the Alembic, group, primitive, and output. So we're going to use the output here. And we're going to just plug that in. And again, we can give this a better name. So here we export it under the out folder. So I'm going to grab that here as well. So we're going to say add hip, add the out folder, output my Alembic. Or we can probably just say like flag sim. And this is a ABC file. So again, we have a lot of different settings we can play around with, but most of the time don't have to worry about these. And I'm gonna just go here to render the frame range. So we're actually having a simulation from 1 to 80. And let's already just press save to disk. And that is done. So what exactly is this Alembic file now? So an Alembic file is basically we are sort of like saving out the mesh each frame. So it's just like a collection of the meshes for each frame. So the downside of this is that file sizes can go pretty high. So currently I have around 11 megabytes for this basic simulation, where my simulation of this DemBones has a file size of around 400 kilobytes. So you can already see that there's a big difference between that. So Alembic files is not something that you're going to use for everything. And some game engines doesn't even support it. So with Unity and Unreal, they support it. So you don't have to worry about that. So with Alembic files, we can just drag and drop these in here. And again, we see here our output simulation loop. Important here is that we need to set this to a geometry cache. So, and as you can see, it's a experimental setting. So like I said, like it's not something that every game engine is going to support and real Unity support, but it's still something that's not that super heavily used in games. Because again, it's like basically playing multiple meshes like a flipbook over time. So you can play around here with settings. So my start frame and end frame look good. There are some more settings, but most of the time you're good to go by default. So let's just press import here. And this might take a moment based on how complex your Alembic file is. So I'm done here, and let's just drag and drop this in the scene. Again, I have that issue with the scaling, so I'm going to just say 50 here again. So these are my flags. Let's rotate them here 90 degrees. So we have them here available. So let's place this here in my scene, and I'm also going to grab my material with that flag shader, press play, and I can see that works perfectly fine. So it's the exact same result, but again, this is a bit higher in file size, and this is working nicely. So there are some specific settings here you could play around with, like we can have different playback speed, the time offset. So as you can see, I can play around with that here. I can do running, looping, some other settings that we have here specifically for the Alembic files. What I've also not mentioned is that Nanite is actually not something you can enable on the Alembic files. So if you go to try to go to settings for Nanite, there is none, because this is a experimental geometry cache, as they call this. So that's not available. And that's it for this video. So I showed you 3 different ways of how you could export different types soft body simulations or your quad simulations into Unreal. It can be an interesting idea to try all of them out to see how well they work in your project or what your needs are. So again, based on what you have, if you have something super complex, you might go more to a Vertex animation. If you have something very simple, maybe something like a DemBones tool will be more interesting. So you're gonna have to think about what is most interesting for my project, what game engine am I using, what it can be more useful or optimized in a certain situation. So it's about trying things out and experimenting which one will fit your project best. So bringing simulations in Houdini is overall a quite interesting topic. There are so many different ways and approaches. In this video here, we only talked about soft bodies or clods, and in Houdini we have so much other different types of simulations, like rigid bodies, like breaking stuff or doing an explosion, volumes, and other kinds of different fluids, and a lot of different variation we have with Houdini. And I hope you enjoyed this video. Feel free to like, subscribe, and thank you for watching.